or aristic, but like all these ideas are just the same idea that the whole book is the arguments of the preacher against a secular worldview. And so some of the conclusions we talked about last week, we got into this discussion about how depressing and bleak his worldview was. And a lot of comments in and after class were like, well, I don't think that's true. And it's like, yeah, well, if we have an eye on God and we have a relationship with God, those things aren't true. But his point is that he's taking us through in the first person, which means if we're kind of living in the experience of somebody who has a secular worldview or a secularized religion to where there really is, these things are ultimately the hard-line truth underlying that worldview. So that's what Ecclesiastes is attempting to take us through and to help us kind of embody that argument or embody that worldview so we can see its end. And so some of the ends of that worldview are bleak and tough and, there's no better word than bleak. And he's not necessarily saying this is how we ought to be or ought to think, but there is, to a certain degree, even those of us who are in Christ and have faith in God, there is, to a certain degree, an understanding we should have that this is the world. And that this is maybe the outlook for many people without God, or this is just the world that we live in under the sun, without God. And so we need to also have our assumptions or our viewpoints challenged a little bit by this as well, so we can have a little more realistic view, maybe. And hopefully it's not too depressing for us as we do that. But it's good to think through these things as hopeless as they feel sometimes. So let's start off here in chapter 2. I hope you have your Bibles with you. Like I said, I'll bring more of these on Sunday for those of you who don't have one yet. They're very nice. Let's start off here in Ecclesiastes 2. Does somebody want to read verses 1 through 11 for us? Ecclesiastes 2, verses 1 through 11. Go ahead, Connor.
I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure, so enjoy yourself. And behold it too with futility. I said of laughter, it is senseless, and of pleasure, what does this accomplish? I explored with my mind how to refresh my body with wine, while my mind was guiding me wisely, and how to seize foolishness until I could see what good there is for the sons of mankind to do under heaven for the few years of their lives. I enlarged my works. I built houses for myself. I planted vineyards for myself. I made gardens and parks for myself, and I planted them in all kinds of fruit trees. I made ponds of water for myself from which to irrigate a forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves, and I had slaves born at home. I also possessed flocks and herds larger than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. I also amassed for myself silver and gold and the treasures of kings and provinces. I provided for myself male and female singers and the pleasures of the sons of mankind, many concubines. Then I became great and increased more than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. My wisdom also stood by me. All that my eyes desired, I did not refuse them. I did not restrain my heart from any pleasure, for my heart was pleased because of all my labor. And this was my reward for all my labor. So I considered all my activities which my hands had done, and the labor which I exerted, and behold, all was futility and striving after wind, and there was no benefit under the sun.
Thanks, Connor. All right, so what all is pursued in these verses? What all does the preacher pursue in verses 1 through 11 to understand wisdom? What do you see? Just shout out some of the stuff that you see him pursuing. What was that? Houses. He's building projects, right? What else? Pleasures, right, of various kinds. What were some of the pleasures he pursued? Wine, right? So he got into alcohol and the allure there. What else did he get into? Riches. Yeah, he just kind of, all this gold and the silver came into his possession. And what other kind of riches? Gardens and parks. He was landscape architecture. Have you ever been to the Vanderbilt mansion in North Carolina? Is it the Vanderbilt? It's amazing. It's not just the mansion, but the landscape architecture around the acres of land. It is unbelievable how much, it's very Ecclesiastes, how much money and time was spent to build the landscape around there. It's beautiful. Good. What else? What else does he pursue? Entertainment, right? Male and female singers, got the best entertainment around. Anything else? herds and flocks, right? That he diversified his investments as any wise, shrewd business person would do, right? Not just gold and silver, but the investments that reproduce. What else? Women, right? He got himself many concubines, the delight of the sons of man, right? I mean, there is nothing off the table for the preacher to pursue to see if there is, to understand it with wisdom, right? And you look at his perspective. Do you see this? And this is an important thing to see in verse. There's like these little parenthetical in verse 3. I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine. My heart still guiding me with wisdom, right? I mean, does it ever sound like someone you've known? Or like maybe yourself, you're like, yeah, I'm in control here. And maybe the preacher very well was in control. It seems like as you get to the end that there was, But yeah, I'm not sure if we're supposed to take this literally, although this does sound like Solomon. I think what he's looking at all this is saying, look, all these pursuits, what is the conclusion of them? What's the conclusion that he draws? Nothing was gained under the sun. Good. Yeah, it's all vanity. You look at verse 11. I considered all my hands had done, the toil I expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity and a striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. Does this conclusion surprise you? Les?
Well, when I get down to verse 10, I kind of wonder. I kind of wonder if this is Solomon speaking.
Yeah.
If it is, by saying, "My heart took delight in all my work, and this was the reward for my labor. Yet when I surveyed that my hand had done." Do we think he was out there in the fields and the vineyards working?
Yeah.
I don't think he was.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I like you said, it may not have been Solomon that wrote this. It may have been a preacher or some teacher.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it just, I have a side note here saying, is this really Solomon speaking?
Yeah. No, there's lots of times that question comes up in this book, and I think that's a worthy discussion for sometimes. I think it will sidetrack us from missing the point if we get too into it. But I think it is an interesting question to ask. He's certainly trying to sound like Solomon in a lot of ways, right? All of this, like in these first two chapters particularly. As the book goes on, he'll kind of critique rulers a lot, which makes you really wonder, I don't think that Solomon the Wise would have critiqued how oppressive the system was, especially because he did oppress in his rule. He put a lot of people to work to build the temple, and it would have been pretty unbelievable kind of outside perspective on oneself to write Ecclesiastes and say that while being the one who had many people to forced labor and say, look at how unjust this is, right, guys? It's just, there's things like that where there are many questions like that. But good. But does this conclusion surprise you, though? This conclusion about everything being, maybe if we're in a church building asking this question, we all ought to say, yeah, of course not. This is the right conclusion. But if you could really do all this stuff, what project do you have that you think if I could really master this hobby or this craft, then I think I would feel good about myself? Do any of us have those inclinations, I was excited to get into making espresso at home, like you all know. And then I kind of got to a point where I was like, okay, yeah, this is fine. Which is such a small thing, right? But so many hobbies feel this way where it's you get to it and you're like, all right, I got to the whatever abstract finish line I had in my mind. And now it's just now I've sunk a bunch of resources and time into it. Now I feel like I have to keep doing it to justify that. It's just that's the worst place to be. It's maybe I should stop drinking caffeine. I have these questions. Well, now I'm so far in at this point that I'm hooked, just by the investment. And I'm just saying, there are examples of this that I think of where it's I pursue these things, and then I find them to be, well, what was the point of that? Lance?
Focus so much on earthly gain, and just and the world really preaches it is you got to have more. If you have riches, you got all this and it'll bring you happiness. And you just read about people after people who gain all this money and possessions that they ask themselves, is that all there is?
Mm-hmm.
They want more and more, and you're never going to get it on this earth, and you're not going to take it with you. And so you just have to be blessed with what God gives you, but really focus on heaven, and that's really where the pleasures and the gains are going to be eventually.
Yeah. Yes. And that point goes so well with a lot of the discussion we had last week about how the eye is never satisfied with seeing, nor the ear with hearing. Y'all remember that conversation from the earlier in chapter 1? these points go together. That's why these sections were put together. Because this is all about this. This is about, like we want, and no matter how much we get, if that's what we want, we're never going to have enough. It's never going to be really satisfactory. Jesse?
It reminds me of like when you hear like actors who are interviewed and they talk about, oh, I had so much money, and like rock stars that it's like I had so much women and all this stuff, but they all got sick of it, right? Like there's so many people that are super successful and rich that are the most depressed people that you'll ever meet, or that killed themselves.
Yeah.
Actually, a lot of that too, right?
Yeah.
And so that's just the living proof that like the access to that stuff, drugs, rock and roll, wine, whatever it might be, isn't going to be what gives you the joy or the happiness in your life.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's well put. And this is, this is, I think, one of the, I like, this comes early in the book, and I think there's a reason for it. I think this is one of the easier observations for us to wrap our arms around and say, yeah, preacher, like this makes sense. Like I can understand this. And I think this is going to start to build how, not just these pursuits, you might call this section like the hedonistic worldview, where like you should just pursue whatever feels good, which is a worldview that prevails to a lot of people today. I mean, talk about the rock stars, but then there's so many people who are just, I think especially when we're young, this appeals to us, where we think, yeah, if everyone just did what was right and felt good to me, if I just did what feels good to me, like that's what's best. I think we have a whole generation of people who are afraid to work because it might not be their dream job. And that didn't come out of nowhere either, by the way. Like, it's not like they came up with that idea. It was preached to us, and we bought it by an older generation, for whatever reason. And I think out of good intentions, the older generation worked really hard, maybe even go back, like came out of war, and they're like, we want our children to have a better future. And now it's like, don't do it if it's not your dream. Like, it's what it distilled into. And I think we're all culpable in this kind of worldview because we focus so much as a society and a culture on kind of tangible worldly outcomes and lost kind of the plot in that pursuit. Which ironically, Ecclesiastes will say, put sorrow and vexation away from you if you're young and pursue the desires of your heart. So maybe I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth a little bit. I'm getting ahead of myself, though. Why do you think pleasure, possessions, and projects are where the preacher starts? Why do you think this is the first thing he starts to look into and really pursue to figure out where the wisdom or the engagement or the meaning is in it? Pleasure, possessions, and projects. Why does he start there? It's all around, right? Like to Lance's point, and Jesse's point, like these are like the things that we are kind of taught to pursue, right? Or that we just want to. They just feel, they look kind of glitzy and glamour filled, right? What else? Any other ideas about that? I think we had a good discussion about this already. With the challenge is that we realize that they all kind of are fool's gold, right? So many of them. It doesn't mean that none of those things are worthwhile, that you should never take up a hobby or pursue a project, right? But it just means that we have to kind of see them in their proper perspective. The preacher in Ecclesiastes will say, just enjoy it. Enjoy your work and enjoy the time you're doing it. Because the project is kind of the beauty of the project, it's about the journey is how we say it today, right? Yeah, and so I think that this is it, but if we're looking to make our life's meaning around these things, and we're going to find that they lack substance in that way. So let's move into the section we had for tonight. I think we're going to continually be behind in this class for a while. Oh, go ahead, Kathy.
Oh, I was just going back to the challenge. I think the challenge there is just finding a balance for those things. Because we can easily get caught up in those things, but like anything in life, finding a balance is so important.
Yeah. I think it really is the perspective of Ecclesiastes at large, right? Finding the balance with even wisdom. There'll be a point in Ecclesiastes where you say, don't be overly wise. It's like, well, what are you talking about in the book of wisdom when you say, don't be overly wise? But this book at large is going to be about balance, I think. That's a really good perspective. All right, let's move into Ecclesiastes 2:12 through 3:15. This was a section slated for tonight. Did anybody write a 2 to 3 sentence summary of this section? Some of these sections are going to be easier than others, I will say. Does anyone? This for the homework, I know it's no fun to have homework, but it does help to kind of keep the larger perspective on as we're going forward. Do you have one?
So I said, trying to find meaning in wisdom, the wise man leaves everything to someone who didn't work for it. So we must enjoy the good things in life because it comes from God.
Yeah. That's well put. Yeah, that's like this first section really talks about like the ideas of legacy, right? Maria?
Yeah, this is what I wrote in my notes. In chapter 2 of Ecclesiastes, the first few verses describes the Garden of Eden and the boastful pride of life in Matthew 4, 1 and 10.
Yeah. So it does. It does kind of reflect the Garden of Eden stuff in the last section, right? Good. Yeah. So it's funny. There's a section about kind of the vanity of work and the legacy we leave, leading right into this really depressing section about the seasons of life and the beauty that's kind of comes from it, right? At the beginning of chapter 3, that we're going to get into at some point. But look, let's start here as we get into chapter 2, verses 12 through 14. How are wisdom and folly contrasted in these verses? And why is death brought up into the discussion? I've actually put these verses up here. This is the ESV. Ecclesiastes 2, the wrong verses are written on the bottom, but Ecclesiastes 2, verse 12. So I turned to consider wisdom and madness and folly, for what can the man do who comes after the king? Only what has already been done. Then I saw that there is more gain in wisdom than in folly, as there is more gain in light than darkness. The wise person has his eyes in his head, but the fool walks in darkness, and yet I perceive that the same event happens to all of them. So the question before us, how are wisdom and folly contrasted here in these verses? And why does he start bringing up death at the end of this? So how does he contrast wisdom and folly? Go ahead, Kathy.
He talks about walking in light.
Yeah.
Walking in darkness.
Mm-hmm.
And you have the choice of walking in with your eyes closed or
Yeah.
open.
Yeah. No, and that's the Bible as a whole loves that picture, right? Have you ever noticed in the plague of darkness in the 10 plagues in Exodus how the Egyptians who were in darkness, they don't even move for 3 days. Like it's so dark and the darkness is so thick that they can't even see their hand in front of their face and none of them moved. It's like you can't even, what's the next step? Where do we go? It's too risky, too terrifying. That's kind of how, in this contrast of wisdom and folly, that is one of the pictures brought up, right? What else? What else comes up in this comparison, this contrast? Why does he bring up death in this contrast? As he's talking about these two things, how does this last sentence, bringing up death, what connection does it have? We're all going to die, right? No matter how wise or how foolish, everyone's going to die. And really this gets into verse 15 as well. I said in my heart, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? And I said in my heart that this too is also vanity. For of the wise, as of the fool, there is no enduring remembrance, seeing that in days to come all will have been long forgotten. How the wise dies just like a fool. So I hated life because what is done under the sun was grievous to me, for all is vanity and a striving after the wind. It's like, man, it's funny this comes into the discussion of wisdom and folly, because you could say this about anything in life, right? In context of death, why are we doing this? Shouldn't we be doing something else? If it's just all under the sun. I don't mean that literally, okay? But I'm just saying, you can do that about almost anything. But in the context of wisdom and folly, this is an interesting kind of observation, especially in one of the books of the Bible that's supposed to be called wisdom literature. Why does he bring up death here? What kind of bearing does this have on our desire or our interactions with being wise or foolish? Wisdom's better, right? But if we're all going to die, I don't know, is there a point here that we should get? Is there a balance? To Kathy's point earlier, is there a balance in here? Is that what he's striving for? How do we understand this?
Well, it's not really spelled out in the text, I guess, but if you think about wisdom being better than folly, it's because it points to something out of this life.
Yeah.
Right, possibly, right? There's more here.
Yeah.
But it's not in this context. Maybe we'll kind of uncover later as we go, I don't know. But anyways, that's one thought, because God certainly wants us to have wisdom on this earth so that we understand
Yeah.
our relationship with Him.
Yeah.
But I find it, to me, it's good news that He found more to gain in wisdom than folly. So
Yeah.
that's good to hear.
Yeah.
And it's also encouraging that there's more to every once in a while, in my head, I've like wondered, if people don't believe in God, then why aren't there more criminals? Like,
Yeah.
because if I didn't believe in God, I'm sure I could find ways to cheat things, like, and, cheat the system and make a lot of money somehow.
Yeah.
Like computer hacking or who knows what, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I could come up with ways to do it. But there's more to gain in life than darkness, right?
Yeah.
So, like, ultimately, I find that to be an interesting finding.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think there is and maybe it does, because the preacher will kind of break in and say, and point to these things that point to something greater than life under the sun, even when he's considering life under the sun. And I think that's part of this, is there's a ridiculousness in life that he's pointing to. Because we all know, I think what he's leveraging here is this point that we all know wisdom's better. Everyone knows it. But if we're all going to die, why do we all know that? Right? If we all know we're going to die, then why do we care if wisdom's better? Because it's well said, Well, good for you being so wise. I'm going to enjoy my life because we're both going to die anyway. And I think that's what he's saying here, that there's something, again, I think this is the smoky, the idea here of Havel and vanity, is that it's absurd. There's an absurdity in all this. It's so absurd to even be wise, because I'm going to die just like you, And so why would I put all this effort into it? Why would I study for the test? We're all going to graduate high school at some point anyway, and whatever, if my grade point's a little lower than your grade point, I had this attitude, by the way, for a while. If I get a 3.4 and you get a 3.9, what does that mean besides you spent more time studying and I had more fun? Right? But seriously. And then the kids with the 4.0s get more scholarships, and they get into better schools, and maybe they actually do get into a better, maybe it does affect the quality of their lives. It probably does. But for some, it doesn't. For some, all the frittering away and getting a 4.0 ruins them from the stress and everything, And it's all this pressure, and then they don't know what to do besides to go to school. I'm not saying as a criticism. I'm just saying, when you start to think this in practical, real ways that we all live in, you can see that there is something in here, right? What is the benefit of getting 4.0s over 3.4s? Terry?
It kind of goes back to what it said in chapter 1 about we have our labor and we get the reward. We get to enjoy our reward.
Mm-hmm.
And when you view that in a worldly setting, none of it matters, because it shouldn't be our reward that we're thinking about here on earth.
Yeah.
It needs to be we're laboring for the reward in heaven. And
Yeah.
so all these things he's just trying to show us, you're all going to die.
Yeah.
This is all going to happen.
Yeah.
You could all be beat up if, you can have the same fate regardless.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
we're going to have a different reward in heaven.
Yes. Yeah. And this was so hard, I think, for us in a Bible class, talking about these things, because we're all, it's like preaching to the choir, or the opposite maybe, where we all have the same conclusion in mind, right? We all know there's something better than this. And yet he's trying to get us, and maybe this isn't really targeted at us directly, but he's trying to get everyone to understand this, some people will look at religion or look at the Bible and say, well, yeah, there's a lot of wisdom in it. And if you're looking at the Bible just for wisdom, what's the point? It's not going to tick that. You will be wise. There is a ton of wisdom in the Bible. You can learn how to really be good with your finances and good in relationships, how to control your tongue. Proverbs will be so helpful to you. And this book will too. But if you just get wisdom out of Jesus' teaching, then you're missing it, because you're going to die anyway. So who cares how wise you were? I think that's the point he's making. It goes along with everything. I had all this greatness, all this wealth and enjoyment, and maybe you have all this wisdom too. Look at me, I'm so wise. Well, Solomon died. What good did his wisdom do him? And so I know I'm over making this point, but I think this is actually one of the building blocks to his entire argument, that there are things that are wholly good, and yet, as good as they are in scope of death and everything, they're kind of absurdly pointless. If they're out of balance, or if we consider them to be bigger than they actually are. That leads us into the next section, starting in verse 18, where he starts to ask this. I hated all my toil in which I toil under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to the man who will come after me. This is Ecclesiastes 2:18. Verse 19, and who knows whether he will be wise or a fool? Yet he will be master of all for which I toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. This also is vanity. So I turned about and gave my heart up to despair over all the toil of my labors under the sun. Because sometimes a person who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave everything to be enjoyed by someone who did not toil for it. This also is vanity and a great evil. For what has a man from all the toil and striving of heart with which he toils beneath the sun? For all his days are full of sorrow, and his work is a vexation. Even in the night his heart does not rest. This also is vanity. Yikes. This is a hard section, you know. Is there what's the value of leaving a legacy? According to the preacher, goose egg, basically, right? I mean, not much. And yet, again, don't you hear this argument made so often? About leaving an impact or leaving something for the next generation or maybe in families. And listen, is there wisdom in it? Yes, of course. But also, what's the preacher's point when he says this? What point does he bring up? What does he think about this concept of leaving a legacy or working hard to leave something behind for the next generation? How does he talk about it?
Well, I like in verse 19, he says, who knows if he will be wise or a fool?
Yeah.
Because as I study like Western civilization with the kids, it's hilarious because there's so much effort put in by some ruler, some king, to take, this little bit away from France or from England, and then he works so hard, so many men lose their life, and the son comes in and like blows it all on who knows what, and like completely destroys it, and then it takes another like 200 years for somebody, it's just such a mess how much, and it just happens. I mean, it's happened over and over in history, right?
The kings, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's in the Bible too, yeah.
Exactly, but it's funny just how much effort they put into it, and how much pride and how much they get out of that, and then the next one could care less or spends it all, and then it just like recycles, and it just happens, and so it's funny, like how much effort was put in.
Yeah, and his conclusion in verse 19, this also is vanity, right? And then verse 20, what does that lead him to? This vanity leads him to what? Despair. He's like, I'm turning around, I'm like looking around, and my heart goes to despair over all the toil. I'm working hard here. And this guy says, I worked as hard as I could for as long as I could, and then I realized that what's the point? Because who knows what this is like? I'm going to die someday, and I'm going to leave it to who? I mean, if it is Solomon, he leaves it to Rehoboam. What did he do with it? Right? He divided it all, which also, by the way, was because of the problems of the father, too. That's what's funny about this is like, this is so true on every level, where the father that works so hard to leave something for their son often doesn't work hard enough on being a father either, and doesn't make up for their own mistakes. And Solomon's mistakes led to the kingdom being divided because Rehoboam wasn't as wise as him, or maybe you might say as cunning as Solomon, about how to keep the kingdom together even despite those failures. And so even if this is Solomon or not, you can learn from that particular example, right? Or many in Western civilization, or all the kings of the Old Testament. Do you notice he doesn't just call this vanity? At the end of verse 21, what does he call it? He says, this also is a vanity, and what else? Great evil. I mean, what'd you say, Monty? Yeah, he's like, this is intense. He's not just saying everything's vain, but he calls this vain time and time and time again, and then also calls it evil. What has a man, verse 22, from all the toil and striving of heart with which he toils beneath the sun? All his days are full of sorrow, and his work is a vexation. If all we have is life under the sun, the work we do, it's not for anything greater, right, Jan?
But when you get a nice legacy from Aunt Susie, you feel very fond of them, and you think kindly of them, regardless of whether you liked them much when they were alive.
That's true. No, that's true.
So there's a little bit of advantage.
Yes. No, I think listen, I don't think he's speaking to this as if there's no, enjoyment in it, or but from his perspective as Aunt Susie, she's not around to see you enjoy it, She's dead. And Solomon, or whoever wrote this, is the preacher saying, even if I do work all this work, even if they are wise, I won't even be around to see it. So who cares? We're all dead anyway. And then they're going to die. And then them and all their friends are going to die. And it's turtles all the way down. It's just the same conclusion, built on the same conclusion. And again, all these things are not saying that there isn't value. There's value in wisdom. Your eyes are in your head, light's better than darkness. There's value in working and creating comfort and stability for your family. But that's not the point he's making. He's not saying these things are totally worthless and we should never, or meaningless. What he's saying is they're kind of absurd because they do have value, and yet they also at the same time have no value. And we have to wrestle with that paradox. Kathy?
I think there's just no guarantees.
Yeah.
That even if we work so hard and we want to leave something to our kids, there's no guarantees that it's actually going to get used by our children, right?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, there's just no guarantees.
Yeah. No, I think that is a good summation of what he's saying, which is, I think, what kind of points directly to the absurdity of it, where it's like, if this isn't a sure bet, then why did I work so hard for it? Because it's a roll of the dice at the end of the day. And that is absurd. Jesse, and then we'll move on to the next question.
I mean, from this person's perspective, I mean, they're really powerful and rich, right? But for the average person, any legacies that we leave behind isn't going to be remembered by, for sure, more than like one generation.
Yeah.
You know, like if you hand off, a little bit of money to like your kids after you pass away, they'll probably be thankful for it. But after they're gone, like no one remembers anything about you at all, right? I mean, the history books are only filled with like a small number of people, period.
Yeah.
And it's not the average people that are remembered, right? So it's just very futile to think about anything lasting, for us,
Yeah.
especially.
Yeah. No, that's well said. And, think about what actually happens when people leave behind a legacy or an inheritance. Even if, both my parents have come from families of 8 kids, and they were all very loving and well-intentioned as they divided up their parents' estate, but it was still challenging. And they were all very kind. There was nothing, no one to point a finger at, nothing like, you shouldn't have done that. It was all very well, but it was still like very stressful and difficult and challenging, let alone when there's greed or cheating or fighting that comes because of the inheritance, right? Like there's so many examples of seeing that this isn't just hypothetical. This is true, right? This is just a challenge that comes from it. So it's not just that they might misuse it. There's also all these potential pitfalls that come with it. So, how does the preacher, he goes on in the end of this section, verse 24 and on. He says, there is nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God. Verse 25, for apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? For to the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy, but to the sinner he has given the business of gathering and collecting, only to give to one who pleases God. This also is vanity and striving after wind. So how does a preacher encourage us to relate to our labors? Yeah, it's all vain, right? It's a great evil. It's vain. You can't leave it. You can't take it with you. You can't really even leave it behind without some worries. What should we think about it then, preacher? What does he tell us? It's right there in verse 24, right? Just enjoy it. Go ahead, Les, and then Pat.
Things that are enjoyable in life come from God.
Yeah.
That's what he's saying here. I saw this, it's from God.
Yeah.
Things that I really enjoy, and I should be thankful for that.
Sure. Yes. Yes. Pat?
I was just thinking the things you leave behind as your legacy generally aren't things.
Yeah.
It's what you've done for people that you leave behind. That's your legacy.
Yeah.
Taking your children to church Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, that's a legacy that does go on, because then they will do it for their children. Being kind to your neighbor is something that is, Micah 6:8. When you do those things, that's a legacy.
Yes.
The legacy he's talking about here is the physical legacy, as opposed, and then this verse brings us back to the other legacy.
Yeah, it's interesting how even though the preacher is like observing life under the sun, like these physical legacies or whatever, he can't even help but to kind of have his theology, his faith break in, right? This is a gift. This is from the hand of God. There's nothing else to see from it, because even the ability, like he's going to say, even the ability to enjoy it, that's not even a foregone conclusion, right? I mean, even if you have the right perspective, okay, I know that I've worked hard for this, I'm going to enjoy it, but then he's going to outline in this book later on, there's many times where people work and they can't enjoy it. Some people by forced labor have there have been many people in this world who have been slaves. They work, what enjoyment do they get out of their labor? What fruit do they get from it? Nothing is taken from them. It's horrible. It's heinous. It's absurd. But that happens to so many. And then there's whole nations, like the Jewish nation under Rome, like all the exorbitant taxes, that's just taxation throughout the centuries, right? That's how the American Revolution started. But whatever the case, like all these things happen, and it's because of someone else putting their thumb on a smaller, weaker person, and they can't do anything about it. And the heart cries out. We'll actually talk about this in the next section we get to next week. And yet, even the ability to enjoy it is you have to see it. It's from the hand of God. If you can enjoy your labors and the work and the fruit of your labor, that's not even guaranteed. And so we got to think, like, wow, this is amazing. I get to enjoy this. What a gift. Let's see. So how does the preacher's thoughts wrap up in 2:26? And do you agree with his conclusion? I want to hear why or why not. We already read this, but in verse 26, he puts it like this: for to the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy, but to the sinner he has given the business of gathering and collecting, only to give to one who pleases God. This is a wild conclusion. What do you think about it? Do you agree with it? I want to hear your reason, because this is a tough one. If you just told somebody, this is someone didn't know from anybody, hey, this is how the world works, by the way. To the one who God is pleased with, you can enjoy it, and he's given you wisdom. But the one who's not, you're just going to be gathering and collecting for somebody else. Whew, that's tough.
I don't think so. When we get to chapter 3, we find out all the things that happen to all of us.
Yeah. Yeah, so there isn't a grand equality in all of it, right? There's a season for everything, and there's times where we're planting, but there's times when we're going to be mourning, whatever, dancing, all the opposites in there. Good. Kim?
In Matthew 5:45, it says that he sends the rain on the just and the unjust.
Yeah.
So I don't think, that's really true.
Yeah. So in the perspective of God, this isn't God's way, right? Which is so, this is why this book is hard to understand and complex, right? Because he's making these conclusions, and he's kind of saying these audacious things, right? This isn't literally God's perspective on how God works. But this is, again, he's looking at life under the sun, and he's going to have these questions through the book about God. Is God for us, really? Is he really kind? And so there's these we have to kind of wrestle with what his point here is. But yet there also is a truth in some of this, right? Where there is, some people will get to enjoy it and get the wisdom. It's what do we think of this, Jesse?
In a sense, I think I can put together an argument for why I agree with him in a sense, because in Proverbs we know that the beginning of fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, right? So in that sense, if you do fear the Lord, you have understanding and appreciation of the Lord. And then you begin to gain access to wisdom. That's what it says, right? And so in that way, God has given wisdom and knowledge, right, to those who fear him. Yeah. Right? But to the sinner, he's given the business of gathering and collecting. And if you think about that from the perspective of, if you aren't abiding in God, you're building bigger barns. Yeah. You're buying bigger houses, collecting cars, whatever you're doing, you're gathering and collecting things, physical things of the world, and that is not going to matter. That's also vanity. Yeah, so there is there's an observable truth in this, somewhat. But it also is not accurately true of God's mind. And this is where, I think it's I almost think Ecclesiastes is easier to understand if you are the person he's arguing with. If you are the secularist or the atheist or the agnostic, these arguments maybe actually, but for us, we're no, that's not how God is, because he isn't. That's not who he reveals himself to be or who he says he is, or even in the rest of the Bible, Old Testament or New. Matthew 5:45, it's in Exodus as well. This isn't who he reveals himself to be. And so we have to wrestle with the point here, right? Kathy?
I think I agree with him too, because God has given wisdom, knowledge, and joy, which are things that satisfy. Whereas the sinner is looking for gathering and collecting because he's never satisfied. So I think there's a truth to that.
Yeah, and there's kind of a pragmatic truth in this, right? From both perspectives. Yeah. I think the hard part that sounds hard no matter what is this to the one who pleases him, right? And I guess the one who pleases him is the one who fears him, and so that you could take that line of argument that you're both pointing out. But I think as we zoom out, and as he concludes this section, he's looking at, this also overlooks verse 25 where he says, "Who, apart from God, who can eat or drink or who can have enjoyment?" Right? And so this is one of the times where it breaks in and says, even if you're rich and you don't have God, this gets back to the earlier points, are you going to enjoy it? Will you enjoy it? Really, if I gave you $5 million, it doesn't sound like that much anymore with inflation, If I gave you $300 gazillion, it's like, what would it bring you? It would bring you a lot of consternation and pain and problems and a lot of people knocking on your door. And would you even enjoy it? Now, a lot of you say, yes, of course I would enjoy it, Ben. And of course, these are things that you can say when you're feeling comfortable. But I think that's just the point. In the heart of this, he's trying to strike a chord with us to make sure we understand that these things that we find so much inherent value in, really, we have to question our relationship with them. Because even the ability to enjoy the money we have isn't a foregone conclusion. And we have to really consider that even the ability to enjoy it is something that has to be learned. And if you don't have God in your life, are you going to learn it? Maybe the conclusion. Maybe the question he has. Go ahead, Les.
Well, reading this section and so forth, and I think it's good for us to reflect back on our lives. Have we enjoyed our jobs, our toil, and so forth?
Yeah.
And if we have, then that means maybe we've been pleasing God at the same time that we're doing all of this, versus hard times that come along, whatever it might be. Then you kind of wonder, well, what did I do wrong or something? And I can sit here and look back my 36-year career as a programmer and so forth, and I just don't see where I had a lot of trouble or a lot of problems with my job. I liked my job.
Yeah.
It was really very satisfactory to me.
Yeah. Yeah, there's an interesting perspective in there. Terry, I'll give you the last
I
word.
was thinking where the true wisdom comes in, regardless of if we've had a difficult time or we've had an easy life, when we look back, we see what we've learned from it.
Yeah.
And I think when we've been through those difficult times, we see that God has blessed us in those times.
Yeah.
That we didn't go hungry, that we were able to build relationship, whatever we did. And I think that's where we can sit back and look, is when we have that perspective.
Yeah, one last thing I'll say about this. I agree with both. I think there's wisdom in both, but I think there is something here that we need to take and say, whatever pursuit we have, I think he's kind of wrapping up this conclusion of the whole section, saying none of it's enough. And this is where his own faith or his own perspective on God breaks in and says, look, all these things, even the ability to enjoy it, it only comes from really pursuing and understanding what's more important. And even I worked at Starbucks and I did the same job as my coworkers, and 75% of my coworkers hated their jobs and hated being at work and hated the customers and hated everything. Why? Well, it's just a matter of perspective, really. And I think sometimes when you realize, there's so much that faith changes in your perspective of every little thing, that it kind of elevates everything from the small, foolish, meaningless thing that it is, giving someone a latte, to an interaction with someone where you can share and connect and all these things. You can do that without God, possibly. But really, even the ability to do that, there is something larger at stake, right? There is something bigger you have to connect to. And I think that's kind of his point, is that all these things, if you're just connected to the physical kind of grind and earning and investment of it, then you will never be satisfied. Because why would I be satisfied working at Starbucks? I'm not making enough money to handle this person, how grumpy they are, or to deal with this mess. But when you have this perspective, if you're pleasing to God, you want to please him, then you have a perspective that lifts you out of the small moment to something greater. I don't know, maybe that's kind of where I come down on this. But it's a really interesting conclusion nonetheless. So we'll pick up at the beginning of chapter 3 next time. We're really handling a chapter a week. I wasn't expecting that, so that's good. There's some questions up here because we're kind of off the base a little on the questions. Come get the questions up here on your way out, and they'll be helpful for next week.